Welcome to What's Next. It's Aki Anastasiou with you, and it's a great pleasure to talk about, we take it for granted that there's this massive growth. We hear about artificial intelligence, we hear about the networks of the future, we hear about 5G, we hear about cloud storage, but you need the tool to be able to finance this innovation going forward, and it costs a lot of money to do this. And globally, we've seen tremendous growth in the last year, with the result of COVID-19. I think it's really spurred much of this change that we're seeing around us. And the reality is most of us are still working from home, but innovation is still taking place. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Reagile Moatshe, who is the Head of Supplier Finance at Investec. Reagile, a good day to you. Thank you for joining us on What's Next. I see that Investec and many of the banks and I guess most people who are involved in the corporate world are still working remotely, as you are. I can see in the background. You're definitely not in your office on Santon Drive.
Definitely not in the office at Santon Drive, but sitting comfortably at home. So we just needed to make the home comfortable, find a suitable place, and carry on working, Aki.
Yeah. Listen, you've got a very interesting portfolio. You talk about, the growth, and I was talking about this massive explosion that we've seen, and organizations really, fast tracking what they had in mind to do in 5 years from now. Massive innovation taking place in IoT, in 5G. We're talking about really the scalability and adaptation to the changes that are happening around us, and the importance of an organization like Investec, who provides a lot of the finance. But I mean, from your aspect, when you look at what's happened and where we're going, what are some of the trends that you are seeing shaping the telecoms industry? Because I think if it wasn't for the mature telecoms industry that we had in South Africa, I think we'd all be in a lot of trouble working from home. So what kind of trends are you seeing currently in the telecoms industry?
Well, let me start off by saying that historically, we've been intensively involved in the funding of the growth of the telecom sector, from the days of copper and fixed line into the evolution looking at mobile network operators. So we've seen the space grow over time, and we've seen the space being a big carrier in terms of growth of the economy, facilitating businesses to communicate, enterprises to grow, and also one seeing the growth in the data. I think the themes that we're seeing within the telecom space is just a growth in the amount of data that we see being produced, data that gets generated at an enterprise level, data that gets generated at a retail level, like you and myself, and looking at where the data needs to be stored. And the telecoms infrastructure providers have always been the backbone on which all this connectivity, all this networking, and the transmission of data would have been carried and will continue to be carried for some time to come. And some of the trends that we continue to see as well is the continued investment by the mobile network operators as well as the network providers in ensuring that their infrastructure is able to carry the communication as well as the flow of data that we see flowing through our networks, particularly going into lockdown since last year, when all of a sudden we needed now to comfortably work from home, ensure that we are productive, able to deliver service and value to our customers. That needed a very stable platform in terms of telecoms networks, as we have been seeing. And I think it has always been around business continuity as well. So how do businesses continue to operate in the midst of not physically being within their traditional spaces, within the traditional office environment? And that's where telecoms, as well as the advancement of networks, have come into play more than ever.
Oh, that's it's fascinating. I was actually talking to some people in education from a university point of view and a primary school point of view, and even learners today. Your average learner who's in primary school or high school, they're probably using 30 gigs of data. Not probably, they are using at least 30 gigs of data a month to continue working remotely. And I mean, You look at university students, for example. So it's really interesting to see this explosion. But and this growth has been amazing. We're talking about networks and fiber organizations literally doubling their capacity over the last year. With this kind of growth and this fast-paced change that we've seen, how is Investec supporting, the telcos, the telecom industry, new networks, innovation in this space? I mean, 5G is obviously the next frontier, but how is Investec supporting these telcos?
So we have been following the development and the evolution of the fiber business for quite some time. And for us, we've seen it as the next level of growth. And reason being that South Africa has always been trailing what's been happening in the Western markets in terms of connectivity, but has seen as well the importance that fiber plays in the transmission of data, making sure that connectivity remains sound. On the back of that trends that we've been seeing, we then identified the key players in the market, and we also built our own understanding of how the industry operates, what are the risks, what does it take for an operator to be successful in this sector. And we then partnered up with some of the fiber network operators as we saw them coming up needing a lot of growth finance, because as you can imagine, such a business as an infrastructure provider requires a lot of capital to dig the trenches, lay the fiber, and make sure that as the fiber gets laid as well, there's also a level of business development that accompanies it to ensure that the homes and the businesses where the fiber gets passed, that last mile connectivity is achieved and those homes are connected, because then that's when you start creating the revenue. So I think it's just really a combination of having identified who the key operators are, the strategy, who's behind them from a shareholder perspective, the management as well, their experience in the sector, and essentially provided them with the much needed growth finance. And as they achieved their expectations of earnings, then we're able to release additional capital to enable them to achieve further growth.
That's fascinating. I mean, just out of interest, when you look at the industry and, the founders like MTN and Vodacom in those days, nobody was thinking about this data explosion today. Is it less riskier to fund the growth of telecoms today than it was, say, 10 years ago? Or is it, because you're seeing this incredible growth, the risk is reduced dramatically? Is it less riskier to invest in these organizations today?
I think the way that we look at it, Aki, is that if you look at the world today relative to the world 10 years ago, and you look at the dependency on connectivity, being able to get your cell phone, call your mate, call your business partner, stay in contact with your family, being able to work, for all of that to happen, you need connectivity and you need a reliable infrastructure to be able to do that. And I think as the market has also advanced and increased its dependence on the devices that we use to be able to connect to the network, I think there are more people connected now to the network than there were probably 5 to 10 years ago. If you look at the penetration of, I would say, handheld devices, particularly smartphones, being utilized by you and me, it's more than 100% when you look at the population of South Africa, which essentially means that it is no longer a want in an ordinary sense of the word, but we've become reliant, we've become dependent on utilizing the mobile network operators and the infrastructure and connecting that through that, utilizing the devices. So it's an established business model. It's a business model that is critical to our way of life. And from that perspective, it has established also a profitability. So there is a very well established track record in terms of annuity revenue. And it's a model that we see growing even further as the years go. So from that perspective, we see it as being sufficiently de-risked from a funding point of view.
Okay. No, well, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the demand is through the roof right now for data, and there's no doubt that we're on this trajectory that's going to grow even further. But backing such innovation, and I guess with with telecoms, and we talk about fiber and everything, there's a lot of innovation that surrounds that. And backing such innovation is really, really critical in the early stages of such businesses, as you mentioned. Why is that so?
I think it takes more than just looking at the business that is established and that is generating profits at the time when the request for funding comes through. I think it's about understanding what the vision is and how the vision plays itself out into society. I think also it takes a very good understanding of looking at market trends as well and how we see those market trends developing over time. So if you look at the advent of essentially telecoms when the South African market opened, there was probably very little penetration at the time. And a lot of capital investment went into establishing the networks. And then as the networks matured, as more and more people began connecting into the infrastructure, then it became critical in how we do business. Organizations have also become increasingly dependent in terms of their own digital strategy, in terms of their own business continuity as well. So if you look at how those industries continue to grow, what really gives them the boost in order to attain sustainability is commitment of capital, commitment of funding. And depending as well, Aki, on where they are in their growth phase, you could have a combination of various forms of capital. I think in the early stages when the models are still being tested, then you have a lot more equity that goes ahead of commercial debt, because commercial debt only comes after the profitability and the business model have been established. And because you have gone now beyond just the risky phases of establishing the business concept, you have a lot more debt going into those businesses because it becomes now a game of achieving scale. And you've seen that right across even the fiber operators, from the big ones that are household brands and the ones that even operate on the fringes in the small towns, in order to ensure that the length and breadth of the country is connected, and businesses as well as local communities, including the educational institutions, are able to connect and take part in the digital revolution.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. But, I mean, we talked about the early stages now, but this is a long play. I mean, it's not a short-term investment. This is a long play. And I guess that you ultimately want to unlock even further value in these organizations going forward. How do you help unlock additional value in time for these organizations to grow?
I think you unlock additional value by listening to what your clients are seeking to go to. So I think you've come from a time when, the initial GPRS and 2G and 3G were the order of the day, 4G, and now we're talking about 5G. And then I think one also has to look at then what's next. So if you look at the main theme surrounding, be it the fiber operators or even the mobile network operators, it's really a data-led growth strategy. And where you have the, I would say, the sustainability of such business models dependent on data, then you have to ask yourself around the development of that content and what are the industries that are surrounding the development of that content, and how will they also spur their own growth? What will be the requirement or the demand for funding to ensure that they get off the ground? And I think also one has to look around the technology that supports the data that gets produced. So talking about cybersecurity as an example. So when the data makes its transmission from one source to the next, therefore it becomes exposed to potential hacking and compromising thereof. So cybersecurity then becomes one of the issues that comes up. Then the question is, how then do we facilitate the advancement of that industry within the greater data-led growth strategy? Then also I think, Aki, what you need to consider is that when data gets produced, then it's a question of where does one house the data? So does it stay centrally where it gets generated, or will you have to consider, for example, the advent of data centers as well? And we have seen in the last 3 to 5 years how not only independent data centers have come across, but also your global multinationals have come into the country to set up data warehouses in Western Cape and also inland as well. But you ask yourself as well, so how do these infrastructures continue to function and connect and transmit data at high speeds? They are all dependent on the fiber networks that we see right across the length and breadth of this country. I think what I'm essentially saying is that from the creation and the development of one main infrastructure, then you have all the other industries that get created that support that main industry. So the data center industry, the cloud storage industry, the cybersecurity industry. Then you talk about even further advancements like intelligent edge, when a lot of data gets produced at source and solutioning gets done at source, as opposed to aggregating all of that data at one location and redistributing it back. So how long is a piece of string? Where will this advancement end? I think, living in the information age, there is no limit. I think it just depends on what type of human need will the developers be looking to solve for. And I think in understanding what we are trying to solve for as financiers, then we will have to develop appropriate funding strategies to be able to assist the industry in growing towards that end.
Reagile, at least, it's fascinating listening to you, just talking about it. And, you just take it for granted. You think it's just a fiber, but, there's a lot of spin-offs over there. And we haven't even touched on the injection into the economic growth of a country, the prosperity of a country that all this, offers. And I mean, a few years ago, they did, some research, and the World Telecoms organization, and they worked out that, X amount investment or penetration, unlocks X amount into the economy. And I guess that this is going to get a brand new trajectory when you look at the value that it's adding to people's lives and to businesses, for example. And you look at the prospects of 5G, and we haven't even touched on smart cities and e-businesses that are going to emerge from this. So the specialist finance role that you as Investec play in creating the networks of the future is really, really important.
Absolutely, Aki. So if I look at, say, you talk about the growth of the economy. South Africa is a two-part economy, very well established commercial enterprises with tentacles into the rest of the world. Then you have your SMMEs that also need to, get a fair share of their participation into the growing 5G mobile network operators, all these advancements that are taking place. I think the upside that we see is that if you look at the initial trajectory of a small one-man owned business, if you really wanted to get off the ground, then you needed to have access to your own sources of capital to be able to set up your office, to buy the infrastructure, to buy the PABXs. But then if you look at how a startup business gets off the ground now, because of independent data centers that are able to give access to small enterprises, access to cloud, to cybersecurity, to technology such as IoT, any form of advancements at a fee on a monthly basis. I think it has changed the landscape of essentially giving the best form of success to one-man owned businesses to get off the ground a lot quicker, because they don't require upfront investments of copious amounts of capital in order to get off the ground before they even start generating the initial revenue from the provision of their goods and services. So I think it has leveled the playing field to some level. And at the same time, I think because now you're working with economies that are interconnected, you find that it's much easier for one to come up with a concept and to be able to showcase that product or service onto the global stage. You're able to reach a far wider market. So I think the ingredients for success of businesses are much more pronounced now than they were probably 5-10 years ago, Aki.
Fascinating chatting to you, Reagile. Just in closing, I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but I'm really quite curious. When you look at the balance sheets of the likes of Vodacom and MTN and these guys, and you look at how much money they're investing in future upgrades of their network, I mean, it's billions and billions. When you look at the telecoms industry as a whole, over the next, I don't know how you project this, 18 months, 2-3 years, 5 years, how much money is this industry going to need to grow to the expectations that we have of this, to meet the data growth that we have? And I'm including 5G, I'm including fiber, network rollouts, etc. How big is this industry? How much money does this industry need to get to that level that we should be at in the next 5 years or so?
So I think the way that I would answer it is as follows. So if you look at, maybe the way to contextualize it is to say, if you were to start a new Vodacom or an MTN today, so the replacement cost of the infrastructure that's currently there just within the borders of South Africa, you're talking about billions of rands. So if you are an aspiring new start to get into such an industry, you can imagine the tall order that puts on your own pocket, on your community of shareholders that you might be calling on to be able to get such an industry off the ground. I think going forward, though, with the strong foundation that has been laid by the mobile network operators, I do not believe it means that they will require a lot less investment in the upgrade of their infrastructure, in the maintenance of their infrastructure, to be able to continue to provide world-class services as well as facilities. So if one has a look at 5G as an example and the technology that will be required to ensure that we achieve the speeds that are being spoken about, you're talking about billions. So this is billions in addition to the tens of billions that have already been invested already. And to give you also an idea of what it costs a lot of these mobile network operators just to keep the current infrastructure going, it's actually a large percentage of the revenue that they produce on an annual basis. So it's almost like owning your own car, and to keep it going outside of the maintenance plan. Obviously, it's a relatively bad example because it's not income generating, but it really takes a lot to keep even the current infrastructure going. I think the opportunity that exists, in my opinion, is that given the scale at which the mobile network operators, including the fiber network operators, are functioning at now, they have the users, they've got the numbers, and it's just really about saying, what need are we solving for? So what additional products and services could we produce in order to cross-sell and increase our share of the wallet size that we already have from the existing customer base? And human needs are forever evolving. New requirements come up all the time. So I think it's about staying close to your customers, listening to your customers, and then solving for, or even anticipating the needs that are not even well articulated by the users themselves, and then anticipating those and developing. That keeps one ahead of the curve.
Reagile Moatshe, the Head of Supplier Finance and Investec, it is an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for those fascinating insights. You just take it for granted when you just look at the operators and the growth, but you need to understand that the business side of the growth and the capital injection that this industry needs. And it's really certainly massive and running into billions and probably trillions of rands over the next 5 years. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day and working remotely. And I hope you don't have any interruptions because we're all connected with the networks that we've been talking about. So thank you for your time and best wishes for the future.
Much appreciated, Aki, and all the best to your readers and listeners.